Welcome, and thank you for joining Worcester Historical Museum as we explore the global fast fashion supply chain, examining a garment's life from construction to destruction with Catriona Standfield. I'm Ann Sadik, Director of Development and Pretty Powerful Project Manager. This is the 9th program supporting the museum's landmark exhibit, Pretty Powerful, 100 Years of Voting and Style, which runs through the end of March, Women's History Month. This evening's agenda includes a 45-minute talk and 10 minutes of Q&As estimated to begin at 7:45 p.m. It is my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Charlotte Haller, who will introduce our speaker and monitor the Q&A portion of the program. Charlotte is a professor of history at Worcester State University and is chair of the History and Political Science Department. She earned a PhD in American Women's History and U.S. History from the University of Wisconsin in Madison. Her research and teaching interests include gender and food politics, the history of sexuality, and race and slavery in the United States. Charlotte is guest curator and historian for Pretty Powerful. She co-authored the 100-page companion publication providing scholarly insights and exciting stories about the garments highlighted in this major exhibit. Historical photos, advertisements, and drawings complement the clothing displayed in the show.
Hi, I'm delighted to welcome everyone here tonight and to introduce our speaker, Catriona Standfield. Catriona is an assistant professor in the Department of History and Political Science at Worcester State University. She earned her PhD in political science from the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. Her research focused on gender and race in global institutions. As a scholar who teaches about post-colonialism and gender and who writes about issues in the garment industry at the International Relations blog, Duck of Minerva, we look forward to her presentation. Catriona, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all very much for having me. I have a presentation that I will share now. Great. So a lot of my research is actually on issues related to peace and security, but I really enjoy fashion, and I've learned a lot of feminist analytical tools through my education and my research, and have been thinking more and more about how these linkages come together. And so I'm really, presenting this as a fellow consumer, a fellow lover of fashion, and hoping that it helps us to think about how fashion is also an expression of global citizenship, right? In addition to personal, political expression or style choices or gender expression or any number of things. So we're going to start off by sort of situating fast fashion. What is it? It's a pretty recent phenomenon, so talk a little bit about that. I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about the journey of a garment once we are finished wearing it, and then talk about how the waste garment industry has impacts on places like Accra in Ghana. And lastly, because I don't like to leave people without some action points, I want to talk a little bit about our own individual relationships to fashion and the consumption of garments, but also talk about some broader structural changes that could really help to alleviate some of these issues. Okay. So fast fashion as we know it is more of a business model than a specific brand, although there are brands that we may think of as fast fashion. So it's really a business model based on offering consumers frequent novelty in the form of low-priced, trend-led products. Fast fashion relies on recurring consumption and impulse buying, instilling a sense of urgency when purchasing. So these are really key. It's the Recurring consumption, the act of shopping constantly instead of once a season or once a year or even less. It is the sort of cycle of trends, which has gotten faster and faster over time. If you use Instagram or other forms of social media, you'll notice that we don't just have seasonal trends now, we have micro trends, and there's a whole ecosystem of influencers who communicate these trends and sort of push them to their followers. And often the price point for fast fashion is on the lower end. I have pulled here from YouTube some haul videos. You may or may not have seen these, but they're a fairly recent phenomenon of where people will buy a haul, a really large amount of clothing, sometimes spending, $600 on clothes from a fast fashion retailer like Zara or Shine or Pretty Little Things, and basically, go through and show the world their outfits that they've gotten. And it's really an interesting sort of very public form of consumption of a lot of garments. So fast fashion is a spectrum and a business model. So just because something is priced a bit higher, that actually doesn't mean it may not be fast fashion. Take, for instance, Zara. Zara is one of the leaders in sort of making fashion faster. And however, its price points can really vary from market to market. It's in Europe, it's in North America, it's in Australia, and in each country it'll be priced differently, depending on how it markets itself locally, as whether it in terms of whether it's a more aspirational brand or a more everyday brand. The main point about fast fashion is that it's a large volume and a quick turnover. So you can sort of look at a brand and tell if it's fast fashion by examining, how many styles does it have on sale at any given time? Do these things go on sale very quickly? Is it easy to avoid buying something at full price? Do you see a lot of promotions for deals, 2 for 1, 3 for 1, buy one, get one free? Those are usually pretty reliable indicators of a fast fashion brand. But the problem with fast fashion, right, is that it's a bit of a race to the bottom. So Zara was kind of the leader in fast fashion, and its parent company Inditex is one of the largest garment companies in the world in terms of earnings. But it's being sort of outpaced even by new retailers like Shine and Pretty Little Things, which sell directly to customers on the internet. Amazon is also adopting this model, and they are putting hundreds and hundreds of new styles out every week, and with prices as low as like $3 for a top. So the whole industry kind of gets pulled in this direction as customer expectations change about what we should be spending on a garment and how often we should be buying things. So, as you might have guessed, global textile production has increased rapidly. So the development of fast fashion dates to about the year 2000, where this business model really started to take off. And since sort of the period of 2000 to now, brands produce twice what they did. And if we look at a broader period of time from 1975 to 2018, our global per capita textile production has increased from 13 to 29 pounds per year. So that is counting sort of everyone on the planet. And that textile production is going to include things beyond garments as well, but it does show a startling increase in the just amount of production. And fashion has a very big environmental impact. We tend to think of other industries like shipping or transportation as having really big carbon emissions, but the carbon emissions of the fashion industry are on par with the entire world emissions of passenger vehicles, for instance. So about 8 to 10% of global carbon dioxide emissions. And the fashion industry consumes 20 trillion gallons of water a year. A lot of that is going into growing natural fibers, but also processing fibers, dyeing, and processing fibers into fabric. So what we have is a business model that has also made new consumer habits possible. So it wasn't always the case that people shopped so regularly and bought so much. People would maybe have to make their own clothing, or they would have to, maybe buy 1 or 2 new garments a year, and garments cost a lot more as a percentage of income than they did now. So you bought less, but it was probably quite good quality and you would make it last. Now we consume 62 million metric tons, which is about the same as an imperial ton, I think, of apparel per year. And that consumption continues to grow, and it's projected to reach 102 million metric tons by 2030, which is very, very soon. And just as an aside, one thing that I wanted to mention is that a lot of this consumption is being driven by sort of middle class people. A lot of the sort of haul videos, right, and the sort of people with a regular shopping habit are not the sort of poorest people who maybe can only afford really cheap fast fashion garments. A lot of the consumption is actually really overconsumption by people with disposable incomes. And just in case anyone thinks that, I haven't bought fast fashion, I certainly have. And so, this is a process of learning that I've been going through as well, and thinking about, and I'm looking at my outfit today, I've got like at least 2 garments on that were from fast fashion brands originally. So we're all kind of caught up in this, regardless of your age, market segment, whether you're, in the youth market or older. The fast fashion model has really permeated the fashion business. And as you sort of might guess, the US is really an outlier in terms of consumption. So it consumes more clothing than any other country, at 3.8 billion pounds of clothing each year. And 85% of what Americans buy is sent to landfill. So what we have is a crisis. We have a model of fast fashion that not only promotes overproduction, but overconsumption. We have declining quality of garments as things are churned out more rapidly at lower and lower price points. And so we tend to wear garments for a short amount of time, throw them away more quickly, they become outdated more quickly. And so a lot of clothing now is kind of disposable. On the overproduction side, actually, there's a lot of clothing that is never even sold. So there's a lot of clothing, at retailers like Zara or H&M, which will go to the store and it will sit, maybe for a week on the rack, and then it will be discounted, and then it might be discounted again. But after a certain point, those discounted items will be taken out of the store, and they may be incinerated, they may be sort of warehoused, or they may be shipped off to further resellers or to the secondhand garment industry. So this is also what will happen to returns. They will usually become dead stock rather than going back out on the shop floor. So the habit that a lot of online consumers have of buying something in several sizes, because sizing is inconsistent, and then trying things on at home and sending back the sizes that don't fit. Unfortunately, a lot of people think that, those garments will just go and be sold to someone who needs that size, but they will usually become dead stock. So it's actually a pretty, unfortunately, wasteful habit. So what I want to talk about here is what happens to the clothing that gets thrown away, right? Or donated or whatnot. A lot of the issues that we are probably most familiar with when it comes to the fashion industry in the production phase of the supply chain. So for a long time, labor abuses have been pretty well publicized in the garment industry. There were, movements to boycott brands like Nike, etc., over the use of sweatshop labor. And certainly garment workers continue to face significant issues today. Just recently in California, new legislation was passed to finally ban the piece rate pay system, whereby garment workers were not paid an hourly wage, but were paid per piece that they completed. And what that effectively meant was a lot of workers who tend to be immigrants, tend to be Latino women, were sometimes earning $3 to $5 an hour, which is far, far below the Los Angeles County minimum wage of $15. And LA is really important here because that's where a lot of the US garment industry still exists. Obviously, it's shrunken a lot over time. And then offshore, where a lot of production happens in places like India, Bangladesh, Indonesia. Again, most of the garment workers are women, very poor women, and they have felt the squeeze of fast fashion and the double squeeze of fast fashion during COVID. So when COVID hit, a lot of brands canceled their orders at factories. So that meant that factories were left holding the bag. They were not paid for things they had produced. And that meant that the workers didn't get paid. They lost their jobs. And so there are a lot of extremely vulnerable workers who are still waiting to be paid months and years after these things have happened. So those issues are still very real, very immediate. We have garment workers as part of labor strikes in Myanmar against the coup and the military junta there. So there's a lot going on in this sort of the supply part of the garment supply chain. But we maybe think less or know less about what happens when we divest ourselves of a garment. So that's what I want us to talk about here today. So a lot of us will want to donate our clothing. And so the majority of stuff will tend to actually go to landfill based on the current statistics. So that'll go straight to landfill here in the United States. But many of us will want to donate clothing, right? And many of us have probably sometimes donated things that maybe aren't quite in their most tip-top shape, but we feel guilty about throwing things out. And so donation bins become like a solution to that. The problem that a lot of, thrift stores are facing is an increased volume of clothing, right? Because as we're consuming more, we're also donating more. And the shops simply can't keep up with this. And so a lot of what is donated is also in poor repair. It hasn't been washed, it's stained. And so it will never make it to the shop floor. It may go straight to landfill. A very small percentage will be sold out on a shop floor, but a lot of it will actually go to the domestic secondhand clothing trade. And this is a whole industry in of itself. And there's sort of three main fates that a garment might take. The first is downcycling. So it's not really recycling so much as repurposing the garment for something like mattress stuffing or insulation or rags. It may be recycled, although only about 15% of post-consumer waste textiles are recycled currently. The problem with recycling textiles is that so many textiles are made of blends of different fibers, synthetic, non-synthetic, natural fibers. And so kind of unbaking that cake, right, back into its component parts is actually quite tricky. So most of the textile recycling that we might see labeled is in fact downcycling, although there are some interesting strides being made in terms of recycling technologies, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that at the end of the presentation. The other big chunk of clothing of garments that are still kind of wearable will be exported overseas. And a lot of this clothing is going to low and middle income countries. And approximately 500,000 tons of used clothing are exported in this manner from the United States every year. And this sort of equates to about $700 million of unsold merchandise. So a lot of that dead stock that I talked about would end up in this kind of export stream. So what happens to this clothing is that it's compressed into a bale and exported to a country like Ghana that we're going to talk about. And from there, it may be resold to a local market. A lot of it may end up in landfill or informal dumps, which is what we're going to focus on today. And some of it will be reprocessed and then re-exported on to another country where the cycle will start over and over again. So there isn't really an away, right? When we throw things away or when we donate something, a whole kind of new phase of the garment life takes shape. And a garment can go in a lot of different directions depending on the sort of quality that it's in when we, say, donate it to Goodwill. So you may be wondering, okay, what's the colonialism part of this presentation? So a lot of us are probably familiar with the sort of basic idea of, imperialism, colonialism as, colonial powers like Britain and Spain going to countries in the global south and sort of annexing their territories, exploiting them for natural resources, or enslaving people, right, and transporting them. And that is, certainly the dominant way that colonialism has shown up, at least in recent history. And it has kind of the two elements of exploitation and often settlement in a lot of cases. But if we think about waste colonialism, we're looking at some similar dynamics of dispossession. So here I'm drawing on the work of Dr. Max Liberon, and he defines waste colonialism as the transboundary movement of waste from areas of privilege and affluence to areas with lower economic status and influence. So transboundary here may mean moving within a country or across borders, from areas that are richer to areas that are poorer. So this can happen with all kinds of forms of waste, irregular kind of household refuse, nuclear waste. We may put really polluting industries in places where people are less privileged, less able to kind of resist. So it may also intertwine with things like environmental racism. So what happens when it comes to dispossession, right, is that when you have this waste being put in this location where people are often Indigenous, often marginalized in some way, it tends to make the land no longer usable for its original purposes, whether that's, cultivating food or as a nice place to live or recreate. And so people actually become dispossessed from the land due to the presence of the waste. And so this is why we can sort of think of it as colonialism, right? Under sort of traditional colonialism, there's dispossession, forced dispossession, right, through violence, for instance. In this case, it's sort of dumping on a particular place and making it no longer usable to the inhabitants. So, when we think about fast fashion, right, waste colonialism sort of is often tied to capitalism, but it's not necessarily just capitalist societies that have engaged in waste colonialism. The Soviet Union sort of used land within the Soviet Union in marginal areas as sinks for all kinds of waste. But if we look at fast fashion as the really quintessential capitalist mode of production, right? Ever increasing production, maximization of profits over other goals like social good or maybe quality products. And so here we have a connection between this particular manifestation of a capitalist mode of production that's getting ever bigger, ever faster in search of continuous growth, and with a waste stream that actually is waste colonialism in many ways. It leads to pollution, it leads to dispossession. So I'm going to talk through this and illustrate some of these dynamics by looking at the case of Accra, which is the capital city of Ghana. And Ghana, if you don't know, is a country located in West Africa. And there's an estimated 15 million, so 15 million items of clothing that make it into Accra every week. And it has a very famous market called Kantamanto Market. And Kantamanto Market is largely populated by traders who take the clothing that is imported from overseas, countries like the US, but also Europe, and they resell it. A lot of the traders in Kantamanto might specialize in a particular garment. They might specialize in lady suits or blue jeans or sneakers or t-shirts or something like that. And most of the clothing that is sold there is being sold to locals, right? So there are certain kinds of clothing that are going to be hard for traders in Kantamanto to sell on, given the local climate, right? So big winter puffy jackets are not really needed so much in Ghana, in Accra. And so those are probably not going to be able to be sold on in that particular context. There are also some people who take clothing, imported clothing, and sort of refashion it, remake it, and are, fashion designers and who are very creative. But this is it's a very big trade, right? A lot of people rely on being able to sell secondhand clothing for their livelihood. And so the changes in the flows of clothes overseas, the quality of those clothes has really concrete social, economic, and environmental impacts for people like the traders in Kantamanto. So here is a picture of the Catriona Landfill in Accra, and it is actually closed now. The landfill, because of the sheer volume of clothing that was coming into Kantamanto, actually filled up very, very quickly, then caught on fire and had to be capped and closed. So based on the work of the Dead White Man's Clothes Project, whose work I'm drawing on throughout this presentation, they estimated from talking to Kantamanto traders that about 40% of the clothing traded at Kantamanto ended up in the landfill almost immediately because it just wasn't something that was going to be to the taste of local people, or it wasn't in good enough repair. It wasn't something that people could actually make some money on. So that was basically adding up to about 1 million pounds of clothing going to the landfill every week. And that was in addition to the garments, textiles that were being dumped informally, or that were simply washing from Kantamanto Market into the gutters, and every time it rained, out to the ocean. And so improper waste management has been tied to cholera outbreaks around Accra that have killed dozens of people in recent years. And the issues with the landfill are particularly striking because not only is a landfill a piece of critical infrastructure for any city, they're expensive to build. They're very technically sophisticated in terms of how they manage different levels of waste, which is, that's not an easy sort of thing to kind of keep making in a country like Ghana, where they don't have, very, very big government budgets for these kinds of infrastructure. But there's also people who rely on the landfills to make their own living. So there are waste pickers who work at the dumps, picking out things that can be further recycled, like water bottles or scrap metal. And the volume of clothing at the landfill made their job so much harder because everything would get tangled up. Like if you've ever tried to pull, things out of a bundle of wet clothing out of the washing machine, it all gets tangled together. That's really what it was like for waste pickers in the landfill. And then, of course, it caught on fire, and a lot of the waste pickers lost their livelihoods, lost their equipment, and the people who lived nearby were having to breathe in really toxic smoke. So the economic effects, right, of this trade are particularly pronounced for the Kantamanto traders. So the way that the trade works is that the retailers, the traders in the market, they will receive loans from friends or family or money lenders, and they operate on credit, and they basically have to make a gamble every time they buy a bale of clothing. So they buy a bale, you can't look inside the bale and know what's in there. You buy the bale of jeans, for instance, and then you have to open it and see if you can actually make your money back or even make a profit. And so as the quality of clothing declines, it gets harder and harder for Kantamanto traders to break even or even make a profit. And that puts them at great risk of insolvency. And there's a whole kind of ecosystem of debt that is really balanced on what's inside those bales. Okay, so I wanted to quickly show an illustration of this, of what it looks like to sort a jeans bale in Kantamanto. Let me just make sure that I have the sound. Great.
We're ready to honor God. Honor God, hallelujah. Sister, hallelujah.
My name, full name, or
your full name.
Yeah, Solomon. Okay, I come here 22 years.
And what kind of bale do you cut?
I dey cut London, sometimes American bale, everything I dey cut sometimes.
Always men's jeans.
Oh, I'm always men's jeans. Always men's jeans.
So how do you you kind of big?
Oh, at the floor, okay, if I cut it, most of it gets more for inside. So,
Go for it.
go ahead.
I'm going to skip ahead a bit so we can see some of the end results of the sorting. He's got 100 or so pairs of jeans that he sorts through.
This one be first. This one be second. This one be third.
Okay, so as we saw, Solomon sorted through all of those pairs of jeans and only came out with 8 pairs that he was going to actually make a profit on, about 13 pairs that he would break even on, and then the rest he would not be able to sell and would probably end up in landfill. So you can sort of see how opening those bales is a big gamble, and how as the industry has gotten faster and faster with lower and lower standards, that it's going to be harder for people like Solomon to even break even and make a living as a trader in Kantamanto. So knowing all of this, what can we do? I think I like to think of us as, we're all part of a supply chain, right? We're all sort of united by playing a different role in the lifetime of a garment, like a pair of blue jeans. And so our choices do have impacts on people like waste pickers or traders in Accra. And if fast fashion relies on both overproduction and overconsumption, how do we deal with both sides of that equation? So there's 4 main avenues for dealing with fast fashion's overproduction and overconsumption crisis. The first is at the level of national policy, which would be in the global north to regulate the export and import of clothing, to make it more expensive to import, say, very cheap clothing that fast fashion producers put out, and that would make it maybe less attractive to consumers. So that would require consumers to bear some cost, but it might mean sort of doubling the price of a shirt from $3 to $6. Global North governments, those like the US, could also pass legislation that would hold brands and producers more responsible for the waste management and ensuring that their products weren't ending up mostly in landfill and that they were, making investments in things like circular technologies to recycle textiles back into the garment industry. In the Global South, governments there have already started taking steps to limit the import of clothing because they're simply being overwhelmed. They're using barriers like taxes and quotas to slow down the imports and to try to protect some of their own local garment manufacturers and fashion designers who simply can't compete with these waves of cheap clothing. For fashion industry, there's a lot that can be done to sort of prevent waste at the production stage so that we don't end up with so much dead stock. Things like producing things just in time, or based on demand. There are some brands in particular that have adopted this model, can certainly cut down. More efficient pattern cutting, and of course, being willing to have fewer trends cycling through constantly will also contribute to this. They could be more transparent about the entire supply chain of garments, including production and waste management. And they could be making more investments in textile recycling. Again, we probably need incentives from governments to make that happen. Brands and retailers should be pricing in the actual social and environmental costs of producing and then disposing of their garments. So prices should really reflect the entire cost of the garment beyond just the pittance that the laborer has been paid to produce it. And I would like to see more marketing based on enduring style rather than just quick trends and fads. As consumers, education is very important. So educating ourselves and our communities about these issues in the supply chain. We can advocate for the kinds of policies that I've mentioned. We can advocate for fair wages for garment workers and environmental standards in supply chains, including waste management. And we can, simply consume less, right? Examine our relationship with consumption, right? So I have some tips here. So one thing, aside from advocating for structural change and education, is to really think about like what drives us to consume. There's a lot of really smart marketing that plays on our behavioral triggers that we can sort of opt out of and put some distance between. So if there are social media accounts or apps that tend to make you want to buy, you can maybe put a pause on those. You can unsubscribe from email newsletters that have coupons and deals. We can think about what the emotional triggers might be for us to consume. During the pandemic, people being stuck at home, sort of buying something and having it arrive on the doorstep was one of the few sources of novelty that a lot of us had. And we probably needed to find better ways to manage those emotions. There are also many secondhand options. Secondhand is now a burgeoning industry. There are thrift stores, obviously, but apps now like ThredUp and Depop, where you can find really incredible clothing. Sometimes, if you see at something at a fast fashion store that you really like, chances are within a couple of weeks, it's actually going to be up on those apps for you to buy. And the thing is that we can't like shop our way out of this problem. So rather than sort of replacing our wardrobes with, hemp-based earth tone sustainable clothing, the best thing we can do is to wear the garments that we currently have. That's the most sustainable option. And so that means caring for our garments properly, learning how to mend our garments. I know those of us in the younger generations have to actually make an effort to learn those skills. Make sure we wash them correctly and be gentler on them, and treat all of our garments with respect, even if they are fast fashion. They all kind of deserve to be nurtured so that they can, live a long life and last many wears. buying less is really important as well. So as I mentioned, this is part of examining our relationship with consumption, trying to opt out of the trend cycle and think more about personal style, I think is very helpful. I actually last year in 2021 bought nothing for the entire year. And I found that a really interesting exercise because I would still see a lot of stuff, on social media and be like, oh, that's really cool. And I would put it to the side and I think, well, maybe at the end of the year, if I still really want it, I can have it. And there was only like maybe 3 things out of the entire year that I was then still like really interested in getting once the year was up, which is far less than I probably would have bought otherwise. We can look for sustainable brands and support sustainable brands who are transparent about all aspects of their supply chains. We can upcycle or downcycle our worn garments. And this means, pet bedding, making quilts, turning things into cleaning cloths, refashioning clothes into new garments, maybe getting creative, right? And only then donating clothing that you would be excited to find in a thrift store, because anything less than that is going pretty much straight to landfill or to the secondhand clothing trade that I have just described. So I have some further reading and resources here. I really suggest checking out the Dead White Man's Clothes project, which documents in depth some of the effects of the clothing trade in Accra. There are also some really great books on this issue, Consumed by Aja Barber, Overdressed by Elizabeth Klein, I both really recommend. And then there are podcasts out there that talk extensively about fashion and sustainability in the industry, as well as academic research, and then advocacy groups like the Clean Clothes Campaign and Fashion Revolution that work on issues in the fashion industry across the lifetime of a garment, from production to waste management. So I am going to leave it there, and thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Catriona, for your presentation. I really enjoyed it and gave me so much to think about. I just want to remind the audience that any questions, feel free to post them in the chat, and you can just post them to everybody or send them to me directly. I want to start with just a really broad question, kind of connecting it to the pretty powerful exhibit, which at its most fundamental was about the importance of fashion and the importance of taking fashion seriously. And one of the things that really struck me about your talk was how important fashion is to so many questions, and that we often don't take it seriously, but it like causes, significant environmental problems. It's a significant economic industry. And I wondered, what drew you to explore the fashion industry or these questions of fast fashion? And, did you, run into any kind of skepticism about it being a serious thing to consider, especially within like the field of international relations and political science that's your discipline?
Yeah, so yes to all of that. It's often, it's seen as a feminine concern, right? And things that are associated with women or femininity tend to be very easily dismissed, not taken seriously. And fashion is certainly one of those things. It's seen as kind of maybe vanity, right? And that doesn't really take into account, all of the aspects of the industry, right? It's very real economic, environmental and also political aspects. But then also, what fashion does at an individual level in terms of expressing all kinds of important things about us. So yes, and interestingly, I see very little literature on fast fashion and the industry in my discipline of political science and subfield of international relations. And that is partly because it's very dominated by questions of war and peace, which obviously is very relevant, but they tend to be very masculine, right, areas of study. And most of the people in my field are men. It's still very heavily male dominated. And so the sort of interest isn't there. And among female scholars, feminist scholars are another minority, and we're the ones who may be more likely to take something like this seriously and interrogate it further. So a lot of the research I found was actually in like the business literature, environmental health literature, climate literature, and not really so much in political science. And I do think that's very gendered, but I do think it also speaks to how our gaze can be really limited to what we see as our most immediate concerns, and we simply don't see people, and by we I mean privileged people living in the global north. We don't really see people like those waste pickers or traders in Kantamanto as people that we're actually very closely bound up with, right? They may be touching the things that we've worn. It's actually quite an intimate relationship, but we don't conceive of it that way.
Yeah, I love the way you talk about that. And one of the things that I love about studying fashion and clothing is that intimacy, right? And that if we think about clothing as a supply chain, and that intimate supply chain, like it becomes invisible. We don't think about how this stretches to Ghana or, all of these things, but it does. And the way that you make that visible, I think is really valuable and important in your presentation. I've had a couple of questions come to me directly, so I'm gonna turn to those. So the first question has to do about kind of how do we make sense of what's responsible. And this question references H&M, which will take garments for recycling. And, is that a more responsible way? And I think there's kind of two things. One is maybe bringing them back to the store that sold them to you. Is that a good, maybe a better way to handle it? And then that sort of recycling model. What is your sense of that?
Yeah, so there's a couple issues here. The first is that big brands like H&M are very aware of these critiques, and they engage in some greenwashing. And so there are like Shine, H&M, Zara, they have like conscious eco collections, right? But they don't change their fundamental business model, which causes so much pollution and overproduction, overconsumption. So I tend to be a little skeptical about campaigns from companies that don't seem to be making any broader changes, right? They might just have like a capsule collection, but they haven't changed their entire business model, basically. So it does require a little bit of a skeptical eye to notice when something is kind of genuine and when something is greenwashed or ethically washed, right? And this can actually require a bit of digging. So for me, one thing I look at, if I'm looking at a brand that I haven't seen before, I'll go to their about page on their website or their FAQ page on their website. And a brand that's actually committed to sustainability and ethics is going to tell you, and they're going to tell you in detail. Brands that aren't are going to use very vague buzzwords or just not even have that information on their website. You can also look at the Clean Clothes campaign or Fashion Revolution. They provide reports that score different brands on these different measures of sustainability. At the end of the day, our purchasing dollar is very important, and I think it's important for our own individual moral development to try to bring our consumption in line with our values. But it's not just up to us, right? We also have to think about these broader structural solutions and policies. And if you're looking at, like an in-store recycling program, maybe ask some questions about it, do some research. Is it actually going to be upcycled into textiles, into garments again? Is it going to be downcycled into rags? Would you be better off giving the garment to someone else or reselling it on an app like Depop or doing something else with it? Yeah. So unfortunately, there's not always a lot of easy answers. It really depends on the context and developing some nous, right, as a consumer.
Great answer. Thank you. And then we have another question that I think really kind of gets at the heart of how we understand and think about colonialism, which is why do countries accept these exports, knowing how disruptive and polluting they are, these landfills and dumps on their lands?
Yeah. So, that's a nuanced question, right? Because there's some level of complicity, right, on the part of local authorities, right? At the same time, we see pushback. Countries like Ghana are starting to restrict the amount of clothing that is coming in. But simply put, a lot of post-colonial countries they came into independence with economies that were completely oriented around the needs of the former colonizers. And that usually meant the extraction of raw materials or agricultural products, so mining, agriculture, these kinds of primary industries. And if you build your whole economy on that, you're very, very susceptible to price fluctuations on the global market. It's hard to compete, and it's simply hard to actually develop on the basis of that particular form of an economy in our global system. And so countries have to sort of do what they can to diversify their economies within a somewhat limited set of options. For countries like Ghana, Ghana actually has a very rich history and lots of specific cultural practices around cloth, and cloth is actually a form of currency, and so it's also like about something that makes sense, right? An industry that's going to make sense and chime with local people. And then there's also, how much can governments of the global south say no? Because governments of the global north, they need to put their waste somewhere, right? And so there's a power imbalance as well.
Yeah. You always explain things so clearly and beautifully. It's one of the things I really appreciate about you. When you were talking about, when you had the examples of Ghana, I was thinking about, there's one of the dresses in the Pretty Powerful exhibit is this amazing Ghanaian wedding anniversary dress that I was thinking about you and I when we were at graduation together, when it was the drive-through graduation. But every Worcester State graduation, there's always the Ghanaian families with the amazing outfits. And so that you have this wonderful fashion tradition in Ghana, and then all this fast fashion showing up in the country, and then so there's this very interesting complex relationship of fashion, colonialism, immigration, that's so interesting to me.
Right, hybridity as well, as local people take stuff and make it their own, right? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I believe that we are just about out of time. Anne, are you finishing us up for the evening?
I am. Well, you've given me, and I'd like to thank us, our audience, a lot to think about. I've taken copious notes and just really want to think about how I consume clothes, and I thank you for that. It was just a wonderful, pretty powerful program. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
And Charlotte as well. Thank you for helping us work through these questions. Our next Pretty Powerful program is in 2 weeks. The Politics of Hair, Don't Touch My Hair, will be held on Wednesday, March 16th at 7 p.m. Tanya Mears, Associate Professor of African American History at Worcester State University, will give a brief history of the inclusion and exclusion of Afro-textured hair in white mainstream fashion. Both this evening's program and the program on March 16th are supported in part by a grant from Worcester Arts Council, a local agency, which is supported by the Massachusetts Cultural Council, a state agency. And finally, just thank you once again for joining us for this pretty powerful program. The role of Worcester Historical Museum is to share the stories of Worcester, past, present, and future. Join us in this adventure by following Worcester Historical Museum on Facebook and Instagram. And please stop by the museum to see the pretty powerful exhibit, which is on view only through March 31st. Again, Women's History Month. Thank you for keeping Worcester's history alive today and for future generations. On behalf of all of us at the museum, have a good night.